Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and because we're starting a little late, I'm going to waste no time in introducing our guests, Roger Benham and Heather Shepard, who a few months ago spent some time in Lesbos, Greece, aiding with the refugee crisis there. So we're going to talk to them about their experiences and about what's going on. So welcome, Roger. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks.
And I guess we can start out by giving some background on what has been happening over the winter in Greece, financially and also in terms of the refugee crisis. So we do have slides.
Yeah, so sure. These are some slides that Heather and I put together after we returned, and so we've been giving this presentation kind of in a lecture format. So we'll just kind of go with them, but break in at any time.
I'll do that.
This first slide, just to kind of to familiarize people with what's been going on before we went to Lesbos in February, shows all of these lines on the map are migrant routes where people have been leaving the Southwest Asia and North Africa and crossing the Mediterranean by different routes into Europe, mainly fleeing wars in Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, but also fleeing climate change and general economic disruption in North Africa and Southwest Asia. Taking a look at that map, you can see that there's color-coded countries. There's white countries, and then there's France, Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, Denmark, Italy, Greece. Those countries are all subscribers to the Schengen Treaty, which became very important this last winter and what was going on in Greece, in between Greece and the rest of Europe. The Schengen Treaty says that if you hold a passport from one of those countries, you don't need a visa to travel, study, or work in the other countries. So when refugees got to Greece, they were not able to pass into the other Schengen countries because you can see from the map that there are pink countries in between that are not signatories of that treaty: Macedonia, Serbia, other Balkan countries. So there was a challenge to get from Greece into the rest of Europe to be able to travel freely. Earlier, last winter and last fall of 2015, a lot of refugees were able to travel freely through that Balkan route. And so a lot of people that are coming now to Greece already have family members that have safely made it further north to Germany and to Sweden and other places where there's more opportunities. But everything changed this past winter just when we were there about the availability of travel between Greece and the rest of Europe.
And what Roger mentioned about folks having families already settled in Europe is pretty important, because part of the agreement between these countries for a long time is that one of the first ways to deal with asylum seekers is to reunite families, and that's not being done right now.
So that's been a huge motivation for people who are risking their lives to try to join other family members who have resettled.
The other thing to remember, and like I say, if at any time if you think of something else, Ron, and you want to break in and ask another question, but I think our next slide here was talking about, so it was kind of giving you an idea of more exactly where we were. So, because I know before the show you were discussing that it might be good for people to know what the geography was. So that red arrow that you're seeing on the screen now points to the island of Lesbos, or English speakers pronounce it Lesbos a lot of the time. So that's a huge island that's off the coast of Turkey. That is Greek territory. That's a Greek island. It's famous, if you know your classical poetry, as the home of Sappho, who was one of the greatest of Greek ancient poets. It's where we also get the term lesbian, because Sappho had a school for girls and she would write erotic poetry. And it's a beautiful island. It's about 70,000 people population. Most of those people live in one city, Mytilene, of 35,000. So it's an extremely rural island. Agriculture is really the economy there. But if you look at that island, if you look at your screen, there you can see the blue between it and the mainland of Turkey is very narrow.
So it's really close to Turkey, even though it's Greek territory.
Yes, it's about 8 to 12 kilometers where we were. So for Americans, it's about 12 kilometers, about 8 miles across the straits. Once people got to Lesbos, they were in Greece and they were safe. They were within the European Union. This is a picture. What we did ourselves is we flew to Athens first. We stayed with some friends in Athens that we knew through a mutual friend in New York City. And we stayed in the Exarchia neighborhood of Athens, which is known as the anarchist neighborhood of Athens. There's a very strong anarchist political movement in Greece, as there is a very strong communist party, the strongest communist party in Western Europe. And there are these abandoned storefronts and buildings in Greece that have been squatted as social centers. And a lot of them have been turned into refugee shelters by the people who squatted them since the crisis started. So this is a picture of one of those squats where Greek activists are living side by side with refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. You can see the banner there is in Greek at the top, and then in English, solidarity to refugees and migrants. When we were there, refugees who were staying in Athens, they did not want to stay in Athens. They did not want to stay in Greece. They wanted to move further north into the European Union to places where there were more opportunities and where if they had family members, like I said before, they had already gone. Because the thing to remember about Greece is beginning in 2008, they've been going through a horrible economic meltdown.
Yeah, that has been in the news like all winter. So
Yes. This is more graffiti here. You're looking at it on our screen now. This was graffiti in Exarchia again. So there's a picture of a fetus, an unborn person saying, "Welcome, you owe to the Troika 36,730 euros." So in other words, in Greece, before you're even born, you already owe to the Troika, which is the European Union, the International Monetary Fund,
And the European Central Bank.
you already owe them 36,730 euros, which is about, when we were there, it was about $45,000. So
Yeah.
that's Heather's nodding. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's,
Something like
yeah. So this is the per capita debt that the other Europeans are demanding that Greece repay. Greece has 25% unemployment, so that's about what we had in the U.S. during the Great Depression. Obviously, with a debt like that and unemployment like that, they've been forced into austerity, cutting social services, cutting schools. So they don't have the capacity to provide the opportunities that refugees.
So even though they've been welcoming, they can't really absorb those numbers.
They didn't think that they could. Yeah.
Right.
But as events have played out since we've been in Greece, it turns out that they're doing the best they can with it.
But this is, sorry, I'm a very nervous speaker, but I just want to maybe prompt Roger to talk a little bit about the Greek memory of being refugees, which is.
Yeah. You sure you don't want to talk about that? You brought it up.
I'm just running the slideshow.
Well, okay. So I'm sure you'll have something to add. But if you remember that picture of Lesbos being so close to Turkey, and you yourself said it, something happened in 1921 where there was a huge population transfer between Greece and Turkey. Because in 1921, the Ottoman Empire had fallen, and they were trying to establish a secular nationalist state in Turkey. So in order to do that, they invented a Turkish identity, which was based upon the Turkish language. But there were a lot of people who lived in Turkey who didn't speak Turkish as a first language. And so they decided to expel all of the Greek speakers from Turkey. So that was about 1 million people were forced to leave Turkey. And in return, the Greeks expelled 500,000 Muslims, and they declared that they were Turks, even though they were Greek Muslims. And so there was a big population transfer in 1921. And a lot of the families on Lesbos remembered that. They remembered their grandmothers arriving when they with babies and having left everything behind in Turkey and being and having to start a whole new life in Greece. So it's very much there in the Greek national consciousness that a lot of them have been refugees. And of course, that problem is still ongoing in Cyprus, which is divided between the Turkish occupation and a Greek occupation. So people in Greece are very aware of the idea that one day you could just suddenly lose everything and be forced to flee. So they do have this generally very welcoming attitude towards refugees. Having said that, however, there is also factions of Greek society that are very hostile to refugees. Greece has a very strong fascist party, the Golden Dawn, the strongest one in Western Europe in a lot of ways. And they openly admire Hitler and the Nazis. Their symbol is a modified Greek symbol for infinity that they really tried to make look like a Hakenkreuz, like a swastika. They are straight out fascists. And they actually had quite a few seats in Parliament. Most of their members of Parliament are currently under prosecution for conspiracy to murder, involved in street fights and stuff.
Whoa.
But there is a significant, right-wing movement in Greece, as there is in other European countries, that is very hostile to refugees, very hostile to anyone who's not Greek. But the vast majority of Greek people that we met, whether they were anarchists or socialists or just regular people with no real political affiliation, were welcoming to refugees. But at the same time, they're unemployed. They've lost their savings. In many cases, they've lost their houses. The government is now being forced to lean on them for taxes because they want to repay this debt. You can't go to a single store in Greece and not get a receipt. It doesn't matter if it's just a tiny produce seller or whatever, because there's a law that says if you don't produce a receipt, you're going to get heavy fines to prevent any kind of under-the-table dealings, because they need to tax even small businesses
Everything,
very
yeah.
strongly. Yeah.
They actually this year started preemptively calculating taxes and charging people and businesses based on what the government projects your income should be.
A year in advance to pay that. So
Yeah,
Greece
that
is,
sounds pretty desperate.
yeah.
It is desperate, yeah.
And of course, the thing is, Greece has their government, Syriza, came to power as the first explicitly anti-capitalist party elected in a Western democracy. And the people that were in Syriza were coming out of the anti-capitalist movements, anti-globalization movements, global justice movements. So there was a lot of excitement when Syriza was elected. But as we've seen all too often, when a leftist government or a progressive government gets elected in a situation that's controlled from outside, they were not able to implement any of their progressive policies. And in fact, they have buckled under even more than the previous, more right-wing government has to austerity demands.
So really squeezed.
Yeah.
So
Oh, this is the one that didn't come out.
That's the blank one.
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
you asked earlier why
Right.
why we wanted to go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me just see if the next one is makes any more sense here.
Okay.
Just remember,
Sorry.
you're going. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
about that.
Yeah. So, what motivated you to go to Greece at this time of extreme stress there?
Well, I think anyone that is paying attention and thinks that they have the freedom and the means to do something would want to. And we'd been feeling this way for a while, for the last couple of years, feeling, like we had something to offer, but weren't sure exactly how to go about it. And so actually a friend of ours that we have worked with several times over the last 10 or 12 years called us up and told us that he was trying to put together a team, and he had just picked a date, picked a spot, and said, we'll once we make this decision, we will make the contacts that we need to make, and so it was just kind of we'll just pick a date and we'll go, and that turned out really well.
How big a group did you end up going with?
There were 5 of us, 3 of us who were on the team because we are something called street medics, which we can talk about a little bit, and 2 others who have done just a ton of organizing on a lot of different issues, but especially working with veterans and working with Iraq veterans against the war.
And as a part of the work that we've done as street medics, has started to support people in demonstrations, just doing first aid and setting up temporary clinics at mobilizations. But in 2005, some of us got involved going to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and got involved with more kind of like extended community health and disaster situations. So we've sent small teams of people to Haiti after the earthquake. Spent a couple months in New York City after Superstorm Sandy, working in the Rockaways with communities and public housing there. Kind of doing community organizing, sending in medical volunteers. I used to be an EMT. Neither Heather nor I are doctors. We have an emergency medical responder certification. Basically just wilderness first aid. But we have some experience, being plunked into the middle of a community in crisis and working with people there. And our friend Ryan Harvey thought that we would be that we would be a good contribution to this team because of that experience, and so asked us to go. And we found very cheap plane tickets, and a lot of people locally in Willimantic and elsewhere, when they heard we were going, donated a lot of money. So that when I say a lot, I mean several $1,000s for a team of 5 people, which enabled us basically to pretty much break even. We thought we would have to dip into our savings pretty significantly to do this, but we didn't have to with the donations. But we did. It was a very bare bones way to do this, like $450 round trip plane ticket, staying for free with people in Athens, paying for the ferry, and then we connected with this team in Lesbos that maybe Heather will talk more about in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
That was already there.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about CK team. I've got some great slides from them. But the slide that's up now is what our team of 5 Americans, the goals that we came up with for this trip. As you can see, it's pretty self-explanatory, doing as much direct aid as possible, building capacity, meaning like helping to contribute to the infrastructure of the groups that we ended up working with. Building solidarity with the Greek people and with refugees and with anyone doing this kind of solidarity work, and then what we're doing right now, which is
reporting back.
Yes.
So what did you find when you got there?
A lot of sheep, which is what this slide shows. Like Roger mentioned, Lesbos is a very rural agricultural island. Also known as Red Lesbos. So there was communist graffiti everywhere, which you had also mentioned. So this is the northeast corner of the island, and this is where we ended up working with CK Team, which was founded by an English fellow who showed up willing to work with anyone, and found that the big port cities, well, none of them are big, but the biggest port cities were really already sort of overrun with NGOs. They were wall-to-wall volunteers. But in this remote stretch of the coast, there was almost no one working. And this coastline is rocky and treacherous, a very dangerous place for even someone who is a skilled navigator to be trying to land, let alone migrants that are at I'll tell some of their stories about the way they're
Yeah, I'm curious as to how they arrived.
So at any rate, this was a very under a place where not very much attention was being paid. So he decided to kind of put his little flag down at a small lighthouse on this in this remote stretch here. So this is an example. This is what the coast is like here. It's rocky,
it's actually
dangerous.
Gorgeous.
It's beautiful, but it's very dangerous. If you're coming across in the middle of the night in a Zodiac, an inflatable raft with an inflatable speedboat, and they're overloaded, of course, and I'm
guessing the water is not always as calm as it looks in that photo.
Yeah, if you can see in this picture that there are a lot of rocks just below the surface, and so these boats just get torn to shreds, or wrecked. So you can see in the lower left-hand corner of this picture, like all that debris. These are all shipwrecks. So yeah, this is a dangerous part of the coast, and there weren't very many people working there. So he decided to kind of try to bring in more volunteers to work in this stretch. And how he started was, I'm going to go back to this white thing right here is a lighthouse. standing watch at this lighthouse in order to alert rescue divers and rescue and lifeguards that were patrolling the coast, but that, you know, this was a huge stretch. They needed eyes on the ground too. So he started out by just standing watch, you know, 12 hours a day, and gradually bringing in enough volunteers that we could do shifts and staff basically 24 hours a day at this lighthouse. And the idea was that, you know, a lighthouse is supposed to warn people away from a dangerous spot, but people are drawn to it because it's the middle of the night and it's dark and it's the only light they see.
So it's the beacon to where land is.
Right. So the goal initially was to, again, to put these rescue divers and lifeguards in contact with refugee boats that were coming over so that they could guide them to a safer site to land.
So how many people really came to that spot? Were there still a lot of people coming, even though it was a relatively remote area?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
When we first got there, this was at the beginning of February. The weather was very, very bad for a couple of days. So we sailed from Athens to Lesbos on a ferry. It was about a 12-hour ferry ride. And then the weather was very bad. The first day we got there, 2 boats came. The first boat landing that I was present at was a Zodiac, that Heather described, which is an open rubber boat. Mm-hmm. You can picture that. And there were about 25 people on that boat, I believe. Mostly, they were all from Syria and Iraq. And then there was another boat that arrived that day too. And then we had a 5-day stretch where the weather was a 4-day stretch, thank you, where the weather was very, very bad and not a single boat came to this area. And we were thinking about going someplace else because we only had a month to be there. Very glad we didn't, because as soon as the weather cleared, we started to see up to about 5 to 6 boats in this 12-kilometer area that we were patrolling. Mm-hmm. So we were going out, a CK team.
Per night, 5 or 6, you know, yeah.
And CK team, by the way, stands for Coordination Caracas. Caracas is the name of the lighthouse that Heather mentioned. Mm-hmm. The fellow that founded it, Matt Llewellyn, who was just an educator from England who came there last summer wanting to do something, he saw that nobody was meeting refugees at these remote beaches. So what happens is people would come on these boats, crash their boats into the shore, and then in the middle of the night they'd have to walk up these winding farm tracks, perhaps 12 kilometers to a main road. And a lot of times people were, they had hypothermia. There were elderly people, there were toddlers, there were pregnant women with babies, there were people that were sick, people that had gotten surgeries in Turkey. So he decided to hire local folks to go down and meet them with their trucks. And at first there was some organized crime going on there, that people would go down with their trucks, and there was some kind of organized crime activity. So they were trying to get people to pay them a lot of money to take them up these country tracks. So what Matt decided to start to do was to pay local Greek guys who had pickup trucks a fair amount of money to say, like, hey, let's you and me go down and meet these folks and drive them up to the road. And as soon as he started doing that, the organized crime characters went away, because then all these guys in these villages had an economic incentive to not want to have these outsiders with guns on their farm tracks. So they would bring the refugees up to the main road in this village. Mantamatos was a Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders transfer camp. That was the main point that we would bring them to. But also further down the coast, before that, was a smaller NGO had set up in an old cheese factory in the village of Clio, where we actually stayed. And people would come there and get warmed up first and get hot tea before they were sent on to Doctors Without Borders. And then from there, they would get sent to the official registration center further south on the island.
Okay. So I don't know. Are there upcoming slides you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was just trying to remember what was coming next. So this is another view from the lighthouse, and some of the, if you can make out some of this debris on the shore, these are just piles and piles of wrecked boats, especially the wrecked Zodiacs, that just went on for, you know, like miles and miles along this stretch of rocky coast. So kind of in line with our one of our goals of building capacity on those nights when on the days when there hadn't been any boats the night before, when we actually got some rest, we would go out to try to clean up these beaches, which is, you know, a pretty Herculean task, but, you know, one thing at a time.
One wreck at a
stretch
time.
Right, one stretch at a time. So that was something that we did when we had the energy.
Now, did you see evidence of people like drowning before they got there?
None of the boats that we met.
No, we didn't see any. Well, right before we got there, and one of the reasons that Matt came to this remote beach was Ayan Hirsi, who was that Kurdish child who washed up on the beach, and that his family was trying to get to this remote area actually because they were trying to avoid increased Turkish Coast Guard enforcement that was between the areas of Turkey and the safer beaches further south on Lesbos. So that actually is what kind of caused Matt to at first think of coming to the stretch of coastline. But we never saw anything like that. We did see a few boats wreck just at the shore, but not very, very badly. Another problem that was going on was the life jackets that people were forced to buy in Turkey were fake generally. So when people did go into the water, if something did happen to their boat, they were dragged down. Because instead of being real life jackets, if anything, these things were personal flotation devices, which are designed if you're riding a jet ski and you fall off and you're in the water for 1 or 2 minutes. But they're not designed to save your life. And if you cut them open, these were laying all over the beach. You could see that they were full of like flimsy laminate material. Water could totally get into all these layers, so you ended up with this millstone around your neck. And that's why so many people have been drowning, but mostly drowning, you know, far out to sea. We did have, right after we left, they had a pretty significant shipwreck just off the coast at one of the places that we would camp and wait for boats. And a lot of people on that boat were saved because they had real life jackets, which had been distributed in Turkey by this fellow Matt, who took it on himself to go and challenge the Turkish mob and people who were selling his fake life jackets and distributing real life jackets. He always said, we do not advocate anybody to make this crossing. You should not make this crossing. It's not only, it's illegal, but it's dangerous. But then if people were already committed and they had bought their tickets from the smugglers, he made sure that they could get real life jackets. And that there is some evidence that has saved some lives.
Now, when you were there, did you use a lot of your emergency medical skills? And what kind of what kind of health issues did you see?
I think most of what we did was triage. We did very, very little treatment. Part of the situation was that a lot of what we were doing was transport, and it was a pretty long ride in a 4x4 up terrible class 4 steep roads up even to the nearest surface road, and then from there waiting for an ambulance, and then from there an hour to the nearest hospital. So a lot of what we actually did medically was just triage, which is sort of determining the priority of patients. We did a little bit of hands-on treatment, but very little. Most of it was just determining when something was enough of an emergency that someone really needed to be evacuated and to meet an ambulance and seek higher definitive care.
I don't know if you want to go back to your slides. I'm
Sure,
really interested in seeing what you saw there.
Sure. This is actually, right, what we've kind of been talking about. We should have been paging through these, I'm sorry. This is just Roger on day watch at the Coracus Lighthouse with some of our solar panels there in the foreground. And actually, so we did watch by day, but we also we were working with another team that did the night watch that used night vision scopes to do that. And actually, once again, as part of building capacity, the members of our American team that I mentioned earlier that had worked a lot with Iraq veterans against the war, did fundraising with some of their comrades to score 2 new sets of night vision scopes to use at the lighthouse to donate to.
I can
to the
imagine
team.
that would be invaluable.
Yeah, so that was pretty awesome. So here is one of the boat rescue operations that we mentioned, towing in Zodiac.
This is actually that first boat that I mentioned. This is the first day that I was working at the beach. So they had intercepted this boat at sea. It had been crossing in the darkness, and they intercepted it the first light of dawn. So this has about 25 people on
Yeah,
it.
it looks packed.
You can see how packed it is. Like I said, these folks are from Syria and Iraq. Unless you're from Basra in Iraq, you have no experience on the ocean. Syria does have a seacoast, but none of these folks came from that area. These folks were from the interior of Syria. So imagine you've never seen the sea, or maybe you've been there on a holiday, but you certainly don't know anything about navigating a boat at night, overloaded like this, through treacherous seas, with no well, people had phones, so they had GPS, but with really no idea where you were going. So what would normally happen with a boat like this is you're going to pay about 1,000 euros each for each family member. It might take you a year to save that up, working under the table in Turkey. And then once you're put on the boat, the smugglers at the Turkish coast, you wait in a forest on the Turkish coast, they come up with the boat, they pile you in. Once they get on, the smuggler jumps off, points across the darkness and says, Greece, Europe is in that direction, go for it. And then people on the boat would cast around, well, who knows most how to use an outboard motor? And somebody might have said, well, I used to drive a truck. Okay, you're going to be our pilot. And so people would just aim straight across in total darkness, aim for Europe. And that's why they would aim for this lighthouse where the rocks were very treacherous. And so these groups, the 2 boats you see towing them, were volunteer rescuers. When they saw how many boats were getting wrecked at night and how many people were drowning, these are folks from Europe, Western Europe, who were mostly lifeguards, firefighters, paramedics. They organized these 2 groups that we mainly worked with. One was called Sea Watch, and I believe this is one of their boats in this picture. Sea Watch mostly was made up of Germans. There were a couple Americans and English folks that worked with them too. So they had a boat that they had financed with donations. They had a paramedic.
A couple of boats.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
They had a paramedic or a doctor on each boat when they would go out. And there was another group, Proactiva, which was a similar group from Spain. And that had started with lifeguards from Barcelona and bomberos, firefighters from Barcelona and Madrid. And they also had a paramedic or a doctor on their boat, and people that were trained in maritime rescue. So they intercepted this boat, warned them off from the lighthouse, and towed them into the safer harbor, Sonia, which was near the lighthouse. And then we were called down to come down and meet them. And this, I will say that was the first time that I saw somebody get off these boats. And the first thing, there was a man who got off this boat. He must have been about my age. I'm 46, maybe a little bit older. Huge guy, big mustache, very tough looking. He was there with his wife and his 2 children who were toddlers. And as soon as he got onto the beach, he just went off in the corner with his family. There were all these people, 25 people, and all these rescuers coming down. And he just went over in the corner with his family. And I turned to see if he was all right, because he was just sobbing silently. And I realized, he wasn't hurt. He made it clear to me that he wasn't hurt. He was just crying. His family was finally safe after coming from Syria, after escaping the war, after escaping Assad's bombs, escaping ISIS, escaping the Russian bombing, getting through Turkey. And here he was on European soil with his 2 small children and his wife, and he was safe. He wasn't sobbing for very long. He got it together, but it was obviously an incredibly emotional experience. And then I drove him and about 10 other people in my small rental car up the roads, and as I was driving along, he's taking a selfie of me and his family, because this is the first person I met in Europe. So on his phone somewhere, hopefully he got further, is this picture of me at the wheel of our rented Toyota. But very, very moving, to think of what these folks had come through.
We're kind of short on time, so we should.
Yeah, we
rush
have
a
about
little
10
bit,
minutes.
But, this is, as you can see, just for miles and miles, the debris the fake life jackets that Roger was talking about earlier, I think something that's important to mention about those is that, that was those underground factories that were manufacturing those were employing under the table refugees to earn their passage. So this was an operation that was really preying on people from both ends. Oh, there's Roger with his trusty steed. This is, if you can't see the tents in this picture, then that's deliberate. This was a hidden lookout that we had a few kilometers down the coast from the lighthouse. And the reason this was a hidden lookout was because this was the one beach in the vicinity where smugglers actually escorted their passengers all the way across the sound and deposited them on a safe, fairly flat stretch of the coast and took off. Instead of, as Roger had mentioned, jumping off, a few hundred meters out to sea and leaving people on their own. So we didn't want to spook them. We didn't want them to feel like there were people watching. We would wait until they had left and then go down to meet the people that had been dropped off there. This is the largest boat that we met the whole time. This is, you can see, a small foot ferry that is probably rated for about 45 people that came over with 177 people on it. This is just Roger and some other of our team members. That's a sunrise, not a sunset. This is after a long night of transporting people through the water. This is a Doctors Without Borders road sign, because this, we did our best to patrol this long stretch of coast as well as we could, but we were still only, a dozen to 15 people at any given time, covering almost 20 kilometers. So Doctors Without Borders had put these road signs up periodically at all the beaches, pointing people in the direction of, take this path to this dirt track, to this dirt road, to this paved road, and all the way to their tiny camp in Matamoros. Some more of our makeshift solar array. Let's see. Just I like these pictures of our little shanties in the lighthouse, because they show that these little shanties had been built inside historic buildings, so that once this crisis passes, they can be dismantled without having altered the historic buildings.
I think, there's more.
Yep. This is some team members building a stairway up a steep stretch of the coast there, to make it a little safer for people to climb up. A very tiny transit camp, very tiny, just 2 little tents there. This is a spot where people wouldn't be more than an hour or two. You want to talk about the cheese factory at all?
Yeah, this is the cheese factory that I mentioned earlier that was set up as a small transit camp by this leftist NGO, very small non-governmental organization, Borderline Europe. And they got some financing to rent this abandoned cheese factory from the village of Clio. This cheese factory had been started before Borderline Europe got there by women from the village of Clio. So just Greek women, mothers and grandmothers. Refugees were walking up through their village. And so they just opened this cheese factory and started to give them tea, give them clothing donations, set up the bathrooms so that they could take hot showers. So this was a spontaneous effort by women from the village. This group came in and found some financing to pay them money to keep the going, with the women keeping it running. All those women spoke Greek, but then they brought in some folks. This is Heather with our friend Kez, who was from Luxembourg and England. And so they brought in folks that spoke English. It's very likely any group of the refugees that we encountered, one person at least on the boat would speak English, sometimes more. Because if you get any schooling in the Middle East or North Africa, you're generally going to learn a little bit of English. And then a lot of the people that we met too had actually worked for the United States Army or the Marine Corps as translators if they were coming from Iraq. They had fought alongside us in the war against the insurgency. And also, there were people from Kurdistan who had fought alongside us against ISIS. That beach, the picture of Heather, that beach that Heather showed you before when I was standing next to the fire, actually the people on that beach were all Yazidis from northern Iraq, who have been genocided by ISIS. And we met a Yazidi guy who had been a translator with the U.S. Army. And the Army was supposed to get him out. The U.S. Army was supposed to get him out when they withdrew from Iraq, and they left him behind. And then, of course, in 2014, ISIS came in and decided to genocide the Yazidis, kill all the men, and sell all the women into slavery, and basically try to wipe out that religious minority. This is outside the cheese factory. How are we doing for time?
We have like 5 minutes.
Okay, I do want to say a little bit about how the situation has changed.
Yeah, and in fact, I think.
Let me just page. This is a good place to.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk about
Yeah.
what the situation is now, as well as what people can do to help.
Yeah, so we were very fortunate in one way of looking at it to be able to go in February because everyone thought that this crisis was building and building and building. And they were very much afraid of how many people were going to be coming across to the Greek islands in the summer because we were there in the winter, the weather was bad, but last summer and last fall they were seeing thousands and thousands of people a day. That photograph that Heather just showed was actually of the prison Moria, which was used as a processing facility when we were there. There's a picture. This was just used as a processing facility when we were there. But after we left on March 19th, they turned it back into a prison. So you can see graffiti that's been put there by some international volunteers. No one is illegal, no border, no nation. But this facility is now once again a prison. Since March 19, if you arrived on Lesbos or any of the Greek islands from Turkey, you were incarcerated and you were going to be sent back to Turkey. And that's part of a deal that Turkey struck with the European Union that says that for everyone who arrives in Greece illegally, they'll all be sent back to Turkey. And for every single Syrian who's sent back to Turkey, the European Union will take another Syrian from a Turkish refugee camp once they go through the asylum process.
Up to a limit of 43,000, which is not a lot.
Yeah, when you consider that 1 million refugees were accepted by Germany last year. You're talking about millions and millions of people, and they're basically capping it at 40,000 more, and that's it. And what they're supposed to do in return for that is to give Turkey money to improve the lot of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Now, in Turkey, Syrian refugees are not allowed to have jobs. Their children are not allowed to go to school. That's supposed to be changing under the terms of this deal. But this does not address at all non-Syrian nationals, specifically Iraqis who are also fleeing ISIS, or Afghans who are fleeing the Taliban and ISIS. It does not address Eritreans who are fleeing a repressive North Korean-style government. It does not address Libyans who are fleeing an ongoing war with ISIS. It does not address any of the economic migrants. It does not address Yemenis who are fleeing U.S. bombs from Saudi Arabia falling on them. So this deal would seem to be a complete violation of the 1951 Treaty on the Rights of the Refugees, which we signed after World War II because we said what happened to people in World War II would never happen again. So basically Europe is saying that thing, never again, well, except for the first time that we're, as Europe, facing a huge refugee crisis, and then we're going to fold. So this is a violation of international law, this agreement. You cannot deny asylum to people that are fleeing for their lives, and you cannot return them to a country where they're being endangered. Just last week in Greece, for the first time, a court in Lesbos heard the appeal of a Syrian refugee who had arrived after March 19th, who was going to be sent back to Turkey, and this court in Lesbos said, yes, that's right, Turkey is not a safe place for you. That's going to be a challenge to the whole deal, which basically is a challenge to international law.
And I think
Now we have 1 more minute.
Okay.
So in the last minute, can you tell people how they can help or find out more?
Well, I mean, this country isn't doing its part. This country has created so much of this crisis and is taking very little responsibility for it. We're a rich nation. We should be taking many, many, many more refugees than we are.
I would say that on a personal level, you can look to get involved with resettling war refugees in your own community. You can check out Quiet Corner Refugee Resettlement Program. You can also check out IRIS, That is the charity that resettles war refugees in Connecticut, IRIS, I-R-I-S. They're based in New Haven. But to back up what Heather said, we got to organize a political movement to accept more refugees to the United States, to lean on the Europeans to do their part, but also we as Americans have to, we say we're going to accept 10,000 refugees, we should be accepting, in my opinion, at least 1 million.
Thank you. And with that, I'm afraid I have to say good night. It was great having you here. I'm sorry we didn't have another half hour or so, and we'll see you all next week.